Welcome back to Witch Hunt Podcasts. I'm Josh Hutchinson.
And I'm Sarah Jack. You're joining us for the conclusion of our Devil, Witchcraft, and Malleus Maleficarum series with Professor Richard Raiswell.
That's right. This is part 4 of our conversation with Professor Raiswell from the University of Prince Edward Island, continuing our exploration of the Malleus Maleficarum.
Professor Raiswell, who many of you will remember from our Speak of the Devil episode, brings his expertise in medieval devil lore to help us understand this pivotal historical development.
In parts 1 and 2, we began examining how beliefs about demons became intrinsically linked with witchcraft accusations in the 15th century.
In part 3, we began looking at the men behind the philosophy, shaping the book, the Malleus Maleficarum.
Now we're going to delve into the text and structure of the book itself.
If you haven't listened to the previous episodes yet, we recommend you go back and enjoy the beginning of the series first, although this episode can certainly stand on its own.
All series episodes are available now wherever you get your podcasts.
So let's rejoin our conversation with Professor Raiswell as we conclude our examination of demonic and witchcraft beliefs and the Malleus Maleficarum. What does the Malleus actually have to say?
If you're going to open up a copy of the 15th century printing of the Malleus Maleficarum, the first thing you see is a papal bull entitled Summis Desiderantes, that is, desiring with the greatest yearning. This is issued by the Pope of the day, Pope Innocent VIII. It's issued on the 5th of December, 1484. So that's before Innsbruck and it's before Ravensburg. In fact, it's this papal bull that Institoris uses to justify trying to get the bishop in Innsbruck to help him. The papal bull is printed at the start of the Malleus Maleficarum to make the book look as if it's been approved by the Pope. It hasn't. The bull was issued before the book was printed. The Pope hasn't even read the damn thing when the bull is issued. The bull says that the Pope has recently received reports about people who have committed abuses with demons to work spells and incantations. But guess what? Who gave him these reports of these people working spells and incantations? Well, it was Institoris. This bull is written in response to a letter Institoris writes to the Pope. The Pope just copies that bit out and uses it as the preface to his bull. But the bull is not a condemnation of witchcraft at all. What it does is it directs local bishops to cooperate with inquisitors like Institoris and Sprenger. They're showing up in these bishops' dioceses, and the Pope wants the bishop to work with the inquisitors. The Bishop of Innsbruck had initially cooperated with Institoris. So the bull is actually an administrative thing. It's trying to make the jurisdiction between a bishop and an inquisitor clear. The inquisitors and outsiders coming into a bishop's diocese. Bishop, you've got to cooperate with the inquisitor. That's what the bull's about. But it's printed right at the front of the Malleus to make it look as if this gives the book some sort of authority. It doesn't. The book has no authority whatsoever.
How is the Malleus set up and organized?
So it's divided up into 3 very, very different sections. Part 1, it looks like a 15th century university-style textbook. And after all, both Institoris and Sprenger were university-trained men. It's written in a very formal, structured style, what's called a scholastic style. This is a very common style of argumentation in the Middle Ages, developed in the 12th, 13th century. The way it works is you ask a question like, can witches turn people into animals? And then you go through all of your books and find all of the points which suggest that witches can turn people into animals. Then you go through all of your books and find all the points which seem to suggest that they can't. Then the author states his own position, and then he argues why his possession is correct. And then he goes back and he explains away why all the points which seem to contradict him are actually either misunderstood or taken out of context or whatever. So the first part uses this formal university style of argumentation to make the case that the cumulative or elaborative conception of witchcraft is real. That a witch is actually in league with demons and engaged in schemes and stratagems intended to subvert God and creation. And the key idea here is that witches make a pact with demons. The pact is real. It doesn't happen in the imagination. As we discussed in the previous episode, demons have great powers beyond ordinary people. They have great powers because they're not created like people. They're created completely differently. They are aerial creatures, so then can do things that we can't do. They're perfectly natural things for demons to do because they're made that way, but they're different from us. They've got sort of the ability to alter people's senses, to create illusions, to present themselves to people in people's sleep, to bring disease, to cause harm, to appear like angels, all sorts of different things. So when a witch makes a pact with a demon, the demon becomes the power working the magic for the witch. If a witch dips a twig in water and then spins the water around and the water evaporates up into the air and later causes a freak weather event, as was the accusation in Ravensburg, what the witch did was actually pointless. It was the demon who did all of this. The witch is only able to work her harmful magic by virtue of the relationship that she has through this pact with the devil. But what is striking about part one of the Malleus is it's clear that the authors are aware that they're trying to argue that something that is new and controversial. As we saw in Ravensburg and in Innsbruck, Institoris' inquisitions are not wholly successful. It's a flop. In Innsbruck and in Ravensburg, at least one person is acquitted or released. And printing this papal bull at the front of the book isn't a sign that you're secure in the power of your argument. You're trying to actually suggest, hey, the Pope's approved of this book. Oh, it is. And that's also clear in how the book really begins. The very first of these scholastic-style questions that starts off the text. The first question of the book is not, what is a witch? Or is a witch real? It's really, really contrived. This is the first question. It is claiming that witches exist, and he's using the masculine form here, is claiming that witches exist such a Catholic position that to defend the opposite is heresy. What a convoluted and bizarre way of framing the question. He's not trying to prove the reality of witchcraft. Rather, he's arguing that not believing in witches is heresy. So his strategy in this question isn't to try and find evidence pointing to the reality of witchcraft. It's to show that any sources that suggest that witchcraft isn't real have either been misunderstood or don't actually deal with witchcraft. So if there's no evidence to show that witchcraft isn't real, it must be real. It's a completely convoluted way to start the text. Because there's a really important source right up front that suggests that there's a real problem with what Institoris is proposing in terms of the cumulative conception of witchcraft. And that's our old friend, the Canon Episcopi. This is the canon which said that women who believe that they fly through the night on the backs of beasts when summoned by the goddess Diana are deluded. The canon says this is rubbish. It's just not possible. And anybody who thinks that it is worse than a pagan or an infidel. Now, when the canon's written, that's meant to be a slander against the women who believe that they are transported like this. But Institoris and Sprenger are saying, this is actually what's happening. This is real stuff. Their position is contradicted immediately by the canon Episcopi. According to the canon Episcopi, Institoris and Sprenger are worse than pagans or infidels. But there are other problems with the idea of witchcraft they're arguing here. If the devil really has the kind of powers that he seems to have in the Malleus, why does he just muck around doing these petty little things? He's making somebody's child, some peasant's child, become sick or die. He's causing an occasional hailstorm in places like Ravensburg. Yeah, people in Ravensburg are pretty annoyed, but really, that's all you got? He causes men. I mean, they make a big deal of this in the Malleus. It's quite an amusing section. He makes a big deal of talking about how witches sometimes make men think their penises disappeared. Surely, the devil should try and destroy God's creation entirely. Why does he muck around with these petty sort of tricks or annoyances? Related to that is the idea that if the devil working through witches has power, is the devil's power actually comparable to God's? Where's God in all of this? Is God able to stop the devil doing this? Or not? How does this fit in with God's will? Well, it's a real problem. And in fact, you see Institoris and Sprenger and the Malleus arguing all the time that the devil's power is limited. The devil has enormous power to destroy all sorts of things, but God's power is greater. It doesn't let God off the hook, right? I mean, why doesn't God actually step in and stop all of this? Well, I mean, the ultimate answer is that in the end, this evil the devil's doing is ultimately good. We just can't see it from our vantage point stuck in time. So Institoris have to try and get around Episcopi, which says that what they're asserting is impossible, and they have to do something to reconcile their devil, which is doing all sorts of nasty things, with the power of God. And it's quite a tricky balancing act.
How do they get around this?
Well, they get around it by listing a pile of sources. Firstly, they list the old passage from Exodus, which says in Latin, Maleficus non padieris vivere, which means that you ought not suffer a sorcerer to live. Institoris would be using a Latin Bible, and in the Latin Bible, the word which is used is maleficos, which is masculine plural. It changes in Protestant Bibles, it's feminine in Protestant Bibles, and that is accurate, a better reflection of the original Hebrew. But nevertheless, they say that the Bible says that you shouldn't allow witches to live. And he points to a Roman law code from the 6th century, which says that soothsayers should be executed, they should be ripped, they should have their flesh ripped from them by heated iron claws. So both scripture and secular law agree that witchcraft shouldn't be tolerated. And it obviously must be something if these sources are going out of their way to say that it shouldn't be tolerated. But there's still the problem of Episcopi. To get around that, they turn to a 7th century encyclopedia written by a man named Isidore of Seville. Back in 1997, Pope John Paul II considered making Isidore of Seville the patron saint of the internet, presumably because both are enormous repositories of information. It's hard not to conclude skeptically that the reason for this was because Isidore's encyclopedia is full of all sorts of made-up rubbish. It is, that's to be unfair to Isidore, he's writing at a time when he has access to very, very few books. Centralized authority is falling away. Learning is falling away. He's doing the very best that he can. It's just, there's an awful lot of made-up stuff in Isidore. Anyway, Institoris and Sprenger turn to Isidore to see what he has to say about witches. Isidore has nothing at all to say about witches, but he does describe 14 different types of magician. One of them is a soothsayer, which he refers to under the category of a python. This is an allusion to the Old Testament story of the witch of Endor, who is described as having a spirit who's able to predict the future. So what Institoris and Sprenger claim is that episcopacy was just referring to women who had this pythonic spirit in them. Episcopacy says that women are deluded by demons into thinking that they're fine. Sure, that's fine, they say. But when the canon is talking about these women who are deluded, it's actually talking about these women who have this soothsaying, this pythonic spirit in them. It's got nothing to do with witches. We're safe. So they've introduced some sort of really flimsy pretext to get around episcopacy. It's pretty weak by 15th century standards. All they've done is assert that episcopacy isn't relevant if you're discussing demonic witchcraft. But they never properly address the problem of what demonic witchcraft means for the power of God. As I suggested, God is either unable to stop demons making pacts with women to wreak havoc on creation, in which case God is not all-powerful, he can't do it, or God is happy to see demons make pacts with women, in which case he's not merciful, he's a tyrant. It's a real theological conundrum. So, in the end, they fall back on the position that we just don't know. Whenever they're talking about the power of the devil to cause harm, they always add the proviso that this happens with God allowing it to happen. The implication is that God allows this to happen for some reason or another. We don't really know why, but we can be sure that ultimately it's good. We just can't see why it's good because we're stuck down here, stuck in time. It's not a philosophically or emotionally satisfying position at all. But if you don't add some proviso, like with God permitting this to happen, you run into the very real danger of making the devil a very, very powerful figure, almost a rival of God. It really is heresy. It's as bad as you can get in heretical terms.
How do they justify the idea that witches are women?
As I said earlier, the title of the text highlights the fact that the people they think they're talking about are women. Malleus Maleficarum is a feminine noun. Even when they get their grammar mixed up in the actual text, it's quite clear that they're talking about women. To justify the idea that women are more naturally prone to witchcraft than men, the authors draw upon a lot of contemporary literary debate about the capacity, the ability of women. This is known as the querelle de femme, or the dispute about women. It's a literary debate which really begins in the 14th century about the nature of women, their capacity, their capability, their ability to study, their ability to write, their ability to perform rational thought, to engage in the pursuit of knowledge. There are a host of texts written in praise of women in this debate, but obviously Institoris and Sprenger aren't particularly interested in that side of the debate. They're interested in the other side of it. So the misogyny that they draw upon is not particularly new. They just pick it out from the sources of the time. And for them, what they argue is that women inherently a destabilizing force in the world. They cite various biblical passages that suggest that women are naturally angrier than men. They cite some early church authorities. One 4th century source they quote, John Chrysostom, says, "What else is a woman but an enemy to friendship, an inescapable punishment in necessary evil, a natural temptation, a desirable disaster?" Women are naturally weaker. They are feebler in mind and body. They draw on other sources that say that women are naturally intellectually more like children. They have no ability to understand philosophy. They draw on some of the tropes in the Bible. The book of Proverbs describes a woman as a beautiful and foolish woman is like a gold ring in a pig's nose. Women, they continue, are naturally more emotional. They won't be governed by authority or reason. They are fundamentally irrational creatures. And because of that, they don't think about what they do. They go with their base wants and desires. Everything, they write at one point in the Malleus, everything in women is governed by carnal lusting, which is insatiable in them. They seduce men readily. They make themselves irresistible to men. And men become entrapped by women, by their beauty, by the sounds of their voice. Men are unable to resist. The most extreme example of that, of course, is Eve in the Garden of Eden. It was Eve who was tempted by the devil, who then tempted Adam into sin. But of course, women lead men into fornication as well. And here they quote Proverbs 30:15. Which says that there are 4 things that are never satisfied. One of them is the mouth of the womb. Women's multiple orgasms. A woman's lust is never satisfied, they note. So ultimately, because a woman's lust is never satisfied, after she's worn out all of her human lovers, she turns to supernatural ones. She turns to demons to satisfy her lust. And of course, because women are irrational, because they're emotional creatures, because they're driven by their lusts and desires, they're fickle as well. So just as quickly as they set their sights on seducing a man, their love quickly turns to hatred. So because of this, women are much more likely to seek out demons. They seek out demons because demons are better sexual partners than their meager human lovers, but also because when their love turns to hatred, they want to get revenge. They want to get revenge on the men who they feel have wronged them, or the women who are married to these men who they fix their eyes on. And this, for Institoris and Sprenger, is summed up by the etymology of the Latin word femina. That's the Latin word for woman. And they say that the word femina is a compound word comprised of fe and minus, which they take to mean less faith. So for them, the word femina points to somebody who is of less faith. This is a false etymology. It's not where the word femina comes from. But nevertheless, it sums up their position for them. They don't actually add much that's new to the misogynistic tradition itself. What they do is they link it directly into this conception of witchcraft that they're promoting.
And that is just the first part.
Yes.
How is the second part different?
So the second part is comprised of, it's much more readable because it's comprised of evidence that they feel that they have garnered from the confessions and testimony of people who have confessed to witchcraft. It's evidence that's been got from trials. The structure is very different. It's not organized like the university debate style system that was section 1. Instead, what they've got is the evidence from themselves as inquisitors. The evidence from Ravensburg and from Innsbruck shows up here, and from other inquisitors who've conducted trials. They're not trying to make an argument, a theoretical argument here, as they've done in the first part. Rather, what they're doing in this section is saying that they've got good, solid evidence from confessed witches testifying to the kinds of things that they've done. Good, solid, reliable trial evidence. People have confessed, witches have confessed to making pacts with the devil. They've confessed to having intercourse with demons. They've confessed to being able to make it seem as if men have lost their penises. They've confessed to being able to manipulate the weather, to kill infants, to kill animals. What they think they've got are facts. Facts gathered and proven through the most rigorous means for gathering and assessing facts that there is at this point. That is through the legal process. If you think about it today, if you think about how we talk about court cases today, when the media talks about so-and-so arrested for murder, the media says, and the alleged killer was brought to court today. The alleged killer. Then the trial process happens, and afterwards we can say that so-and-so killed so-and-so else. It's become a fact, a legal fact. We don't need to hedge anymore. It's not an alleged killer. No, we know that X killed Y. The legal process turns this stuff into facts. So as far as Institoris is concerned, we've got a growing mountain of broadly consistent evidence from trials of people who couldn't possibly have known each other that attest to the reality of demonic witchcraft and some of the things that witches claimed they'd been capable of doing once allied with demons. Now, the Malleus Maleficarum's authors don't go this far, but later witchcraft authors do. The Malleus authors don't argue this, but their position is that if some of the things that these witches are confessing seem to contradict the theology, that's the problem. The theology needs to be reworked because we've got the evidence, the facts, deduced from witches. This is what they say has happened.
And what happens in the final part of the Malleus?
Well, given that the authors place so much weight on the value of evidence garnered through the legal process, Part 3 describes how witches should be detected and then prosecuted. It's a legal manual. And as we saw, one of the problems that Institoris had in Innsbruck was that some of the things he was trying to do were not standard legal procedure. That's what caused him to fall out with the local bishop then. Institoris' point in the third part of the text is that witchcraft is a special type of crime. Technically, it's what's called a crimen exceptum. It's a technical term which is lifted from Roman law. It's used in Roman law to describe really serious crimes which are very difficult to prove. And because they're very difficult to prove, you use slightly different legal procedures to prosecute people. When the Romans used this term, they used it in the context of treason trials. Obviously, it's vital to the health of the state to root out a conspiracy against the emperor. And conspiracies are usually secret, and they often involve many people, so we can use a different legal procedure for those sorts of crimes. Institoris' point is that prosecuting witches is not like prosecuting a normal suspected murderer. As I said before, when you arrest a murderer, the murdering stops. The murderer is no longer a threat. They're in a jail cell. They're waiting to be sentenced, or waiting for their case. They're waiting to be sentenced. That's not the case with the witch. The witch remains dangerous even while she's in jail. She can use her pact with demons to harm all those people who swore out depositions against them. She can use her power against the judge in the trial. She can use her power to make herself immune from pain under torture. We're in the world of the Inquisition here. Now, there's nothing wrong per se with Inquisition as a method of trial. The word inquisitio in Latin is related to the word quiro, which just means to ask or to inquire. I mean, the modern word inquiry comes from inquisitio. It's just not the legal procedure that we're used to in the Anglophone world, which is based upon common law, ultimately English common law. You use common law in the US, we use it in Canada. But that's not the procedure that's used in inquisitorial trials. Our trials are adversarial. You've got lawyers on one side for the state and lawyers on the other side for the accused. And they make arguments from their respective positions about the guilt or the innocence of the accused before an impartial judge who then gives the evidence to a jury. But that's not what's happening here. What Institoris is setting out to do in this section is to describe how an inquisition should be run. It's a process with a fact-finding exercise in it and also a prosecutorial style of a part of the process as well. It begins with the inquisitor asking anybody in the town if there's anybody who has any suspicion about witchcraft. And just as he did in Innsbruck and in Ravensburg, people are invited to give depositions before the inquisitor. These are secret. They're meant to be secret so the people deposing feel free to depose what they know or what they suspect. And they're secret in order to protect the people making the depositions from any retaliation by the suspected witch. The inquisitor then compiles all of these, and then he reviews them. And when there's enough plausible accusations leveled against a particular person, he begins a formal inquisition against them. This is the first part of the Inquisition proper. It's called the Inquisitio Generalis, the General Inquisition. Some of the people who have made these depositions against particular women are called back, and they're asked to elaborate on their deposition. The inquisitor asks them questions, specific questions about it. What did you mean when you said this? Did you see this sort of person as well? Because the inquisitor's now got all the depositions from the various people, some of which are all pointed towards person X. So he's collating them and trying to get more out of it. It's a fact-finding. It's meant to be a fact-finding exercise. And he's trying also to work out the weight that should be given to each of the various depositions. And he also wants to find out the relationship between the people making the deposition and the people they're accusing. Are these people enemies of each other, for instance? In which case, maybe you don't trust the deposition. But once he's got strong indications against a particular person that they're a witch, they then are arrested. And this arrest marks the second phase of the Inquisition, the Inquisitio Specialis. That is what's often called the trial proper. The problem is that's actually really quite confusing. The process has been going on for a while by this point. The judge, the inquisitor, has been gaining facts, gaining the evidence, and now the accused, only now is the accused brought forward. But the problem is, by this point, the inquisitor already has very strong suspicion that the accused is guilty. If he didn't have that, he wouldn't be bringing the accused in. So this is what people often label as the trial problem, but it's been going on for a while. But this is the part that centers on determining whether the accused is guilty or innocent. Guilt or innocence is left to the determination of the inquisitor himself. He's the one who weighs all of the evidence and determines if the accused is guilty or not.
Is the accused allowed a lawyer?
Yes, she is. The accused is permitted a lawyer. As we saw in Innsbruck, it was the bishop who hired the best lawyer around. But the thing is, Institoris is very keen to limit what the lawyer can do. I mean, you can imagine he was not impressed with what happened with the lawyer in Innsbruck, so he has little time for lawyers. Firstly, a lawyer, he says, is not allowed to defend a hopeless open and shut case. We all know that so-and-so is guilty. You can't defend them. You'll be milking the system. You're just looking to get paid. That's not on. Hopeless case? No, you're not allowed a lawyer. And we don't want some grandstanding lawyer who's just trying to spin things out with all their tricks and their delays. Can't burden the court with all these sorts of delaying tactics. Again, this is what happened in Innsbruck. And the lawyer can't just keep calling all sorts of irrelevant witnesses. That's not on. But crucially, the text also says that a lawyer can't defend heresy. Because if a lawyer openly defends somebody who is found to be a heretic, the lawyer too is a heretic. By definition, you've defended a heretic, that makes you a heretic. So the lawyer himself would be at risk of being prosecuted if he defends somebody who's found guilty. So the ideal lawyer, Institoris says in the Malleus, is an upright person who is not suspected of being fussy about legal niceties. So we're suspending some of the lawyer's abilities. So the scope allowed by the accused to try and defend herself against the accusations is limited by what a lawyer can do. She also still doesn't know the names of the people who have accused her, or even very much about the nature, the specific nature of the charges that she's accused of.
So how do they suggest that an inquisitor get a conviction?
So the accused wouldn't be there. She wouldn't be in front of the inquisitor if there was not a strong suspicion of guilt. But strong suspicion under the law, the Roman law, the canon law that they're using, is not adequate to convict. The legal standard that they have to follow is what's described as proof clearer than daylight. That's the legal standard. It's a standard that they picked up from Roman law and is widely applied across Europe in jurisdictions that don't use common law. This is formally defined as the testimony of two eyewitnesses or a confession. The problem is, in witchcraft cases, how do you get eyewitness evidence against witches? Firstly, witches, by definition, are members of a secret sect. Secret sects are all pledged together by members who pledge not to rat each other out, so that's a problem. But what's more, what suspected witches are accused of doing operates in a secret way. Think about the Ravensburg example, the witch swirling her finger with a twig in a pool of water, and then an hour later, a storm begins. So what is it that the witness needs to have seen? Some woman sitting on the heath, playing in a puddle? What's the causal connection between that and a hailstorm, which all of the testimony said happened an hour later? What did the witness need to see in order for that to be eyewitness testimony of witchery? Yeah, I mean, she probably shouldn't have been sitting on the heath playing in puddle, but that's not a crime. But you need two of these people. And so what do both of them need to have seen? So you saw the woman playing with a puddle, and you've decided that that's witchcraft, but do you actually have to see how somebody else who also saw the same woman playing in the same puddle on the same day? Or is it adequate to say that eyewitness 1 saw the woman playing in the puddle and the hailstorm happened, and eyewitness 2 saw the woman cursing somebody in the village, and then her child got sick 2 days later. What constitutes consistent evidence? Well, what Institoris argues in this is what you need from your eyewitnesses is eyewitness testimony of witchcraft. So that is, you don't actually need them to see the same event. If they're both attesting to the fact that the suspect seems to have caused witchcraft in 2 separate instances, that is consistent evidence of witchcraft. So you're not actually being charged or prosecuted for causing the hailstorm, but you're being charged with witchcraft. And so you need 2 eyewitnesses who can testify to seeing somebody engaged in some sort of nefarious spellcasting or something. But the problem with some of this is, again, much of the eyewitness testimony will actually come from people who might have been involved in this. The woman who is summoned to the heath to cause the hailstorm, nobody else is really going to be following her. She's not going to be bringing her friends around with her. If somebody else is there with her, witnessing it, chances are pretty good that they're another witch. Now, maybe she'll turn on a friend. That's possible. But can you really trust the testimony of somebody who's pledged herself to the devil, that is, who's made a pledge to the father of lies? Surely that person necessarily would lie in court, because that would be what the devil would want her to do. Can you use the testimony of other witches against a witch? Well, you absolutely shouldn't, because somebody who's pledged themselves to a liar obviously can't be trusted. But Institoris said, no, that's a problem. Yeah, no, you can use that. In fact, you can use the testimony of somebody's enemy. You can use the testimony of children. Under Roman law, you can't use the testimony of children. But no, that's fine. Yeah, pretty much anybody. Unless somebody's a sworn enemy of yours, and he even changes what a sworn enemy means. It's somebody who you've actively got a blood feud with, not just the woman in the rival sauerkraut selling booth in the market who you shout at every other day because she's taking your trade, but somebody you've actually got a blood feud with. That is the only person who can't testify against you. So in practice, what this means is eyewitness testimony is going to be difficult. Despite all the relaxations on eyewitness testimony, it's going to be difficult to get eyewitness testimony, which is going to be trustworthy.
So if witnesses will be so hard to come by, how does Institoris recommend that an inquisitor proceed?
Well, that's why confessions become so very, very important. If it's going to be difficult to get eyewitnesses to testify, particularly in the beginning, in early trials. Remember, you begin with the easiest cases and move to the harder cases. Particularly when you're starting off one of these processes, eyewitnesses are going to be hard. So you put a lot of emphasis on getting a confession. And here is where torture comes in. Torture is not meant as a form of punishment. It is technically an evidence-gathering technique. In theory, what they're looking for is that the accused admit elements of the crime that only the accused would know. But that's often not how it works in practice. It's used to extract a confession. But the thing about these confessions is a confession made under torture is not admissible under law. So the witch is taken into the torture chamber. She's tortured. She's asked, do you confess to having made a pact with the devil? Do you confess to having caused these sorts of evil deeds? She eventually says, yes. That's not good enough. She's then taken back upstairs before the Inquisitor, and she has to make her confession again freely without duress. Now, by this point, she's had her limbs dislocated, she's in a very bad way, and obviously she knows that if she doesn't freely confess, she's back downstairs into the torture chamber. Only then, if the Inquisitor gets the confession, Does he have adequate evidence under law to secure a conviction? And then the accused is handed over to the secular authorities for punishment. And as I said, it's the secular authorities who do the execute, who torture, who execute.
So if the Malleus is such a poorly argued book, why is it so important?
Malleus is an important book not because the authors make a good and effective case for witchcraft. There are many other authors who make much more sophisticated and clever arguments. Authors who don't shy away from some of the difficult questions that are implied in what Institoris and Sprenger are doing. The importance of the Malleus really stems from the fact that it appears when it does. It appears right at the beginning of the first information revolution. It takes this elaborated notion of witchcraft that's floating around from the 1430s, 1440s, that people are talking about in church circles and writing about in manuscript. And it gives it a full-scale treatment, which is then printed and circulated quite widely. As I said, it's printed 16 times between its first appearance in 1486, 1487, and then 1519. And then it's printed another 16 times between 1580 and 1650. By 1580, you've got more sophisticated texts floating around, a lot more sophisticated texts written by people who are frankly quite a lot cleverer than Institoris. But I think, and I can't prove this, that these later printings are printed because, not for the theology or for the evidence section, but for the legal section. Because the legal section remains very useful. In fact, when you look through the legal section, he almost gives you sample forms to fill in. You want to begin a deposition. Here's the language that you use. Write this down, post it to the church door. This is how you begin a deposition. That's useful. And it even includes templates for the inquisitors to use during trials, for particular parts of the trial as well. I think, but as I said, I can't prove that these later printings are because the text is still legally useful, even if the theology has been superseded by more sophisticated thinkers. With the Malleus, then, we're on the verge of full-scale witch hunts. Even if the theological arguments are not very robust, we have a definition of a witch. The second part in particular gives us lots of evidence of what witches have confessed in the past to have done. It gives us a sense of their powers, even if the theology hasn't kept up with us. We've got a sense of what the witches say that they've done. And we've got a clear sense of the scale of the conspiracy that we've got. And we've got a streamlined legal process set up to deal with this very special type of crime. We've removed some of the normal legal protections for the accused at the time. We're not going to entertain the normal style legal defense. And as the removal of these protections helps create more successful prosecutions, so we have more good evidence of the depravity and malice that witches show. Trials create proof, popular proof. We still use that sort of idea today. And what all of this evidence shows us, and there is more of it with every single prosecution, is that witchcraft poses an existential threat to society and to everybody in it. And faced with such an enormous threat to society, we all need to be protected. And so witchcraft must be rooted out at any cost possible.
Thank you so much. This has been a really great experience learning all of this today. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I thoroughly enjoyed it.
We'd like to say a special thank you to Dr. Raiswell for crafting this wonderful series for Witch Hunt Podcast.
And we thank you for joining us as we explored the influence of demonology on the European witch hunt. Have a great today and a beautiful tomorrow.